Hello, today's lecture is about social class and how it tries to explain the inequalities related to race and ethnicity. So the agenda for this lecture is first I will talk about how the economy is set up and theories of poverty or social class, why work at all if you're in low income uh, stratification, education inequality, and family inequality. So first we want to talk about how the economy is structured. First, Um, prior to the 1800s, we had hunters and gatherers who would go out and hunt and gather their food over a time period. And then we moved to agricultural communities where a lot of times families would have large number of children so that they could work on the farm. So, for example, my grandfather worked on a farm in Ohio, and then our economy moved to manufacturing capitalism, and this is where Karl Marx and Frederick Engels come into play, where we see that the household is not the production of the economy anymore. We're not working on farms. We're not producing things on the farm. We're not working together on the farm to produce things, but we go off to a factory or someplace else to earn wages, and then we take those wages back home. And this is where you see like Charlotte Perkins Gilman talking about how women do a lot of work in the home, but they don't get paid for it, um, and those kind of places. And where we see breadwinners who are men and homemakers who are women. Today, some people argue that we're in a post-capitalistic system where everything is about service, and so it's about buying and purchasing and selling services to people. So you can think of like Uber, who can independent contract person, so you can work as many hours as you want, but you can't get any health insurance, you can't get any things like that. So, first theory of poverty or lower class is blaming the victim. So, it's a poor problem. It's their fault that they're poor. And this can be seen in higher social economic status situations where the middle class or higher will say to that person, well, uh, do, uh, why didn't they go to community college to get their degree? Why didn't they do trade school? Why are they lazy, not working? Why aren't they out there getting jobs and things like that? So that's one example of a theory of poverty. The second example is a culture of poverty. This is the idea that poverty is a result of socialization of a certain self-defeating values and beliefs. And you can see this was produced by a researcher who interviewed 8 Puerto Rican families. And then this has been taken up throughout society in the 1960s. You have the Moynihan Report, which argued that black single mother families um, provided defeating values and beliefs, especially towards their sons. And this would explain why um, black single mother families were not doing as well in social class. So if you ever hear about a sense of resignation, like, oh, they didn't study enough, they don't have access to books, it's the parents' problem, parents' fault that they're not taking education seriously, unwilling to plan for the future, inability to defer gratification, and suspicion of authority are all examples of the values and beliefs that the culture of poverty upholds. Now, over numerous studies, culture of poverty has been disproven. However, this is still a theme throughout politics and society about how the poor basically don't value education, so they're just going to stay poor. Structural explanations of poverty is the result of persistent inequalities or unequal opportunities, and these are results of racism, those in power to discriminate against poor minorities, sexism, those in power to discriminate against women, or transgender or non-gender binary, and then economic and educational structures. So there's poor lack of opportunities. And if you think about um, educational structures, the wealthy schools of, for example, of Naperville, right, um, would have lots and lots of resources, potentially lots and lots of resources, more resources for buildings and for all that kind of stuff, and and then a lower class educational system would not have as many resources. We also see in lower income school districts, teacher turnover is high. They usually get the first year teachers instead of the expert teachers. And also, the buildings are not as nice. They flood more often, things like that. So William Julius Wilson theory of the underclass is that there has been changes of economic structure, and the nature of the change, especially in the black communities, is middle working class have become hyper-ghettoization factors, which means basically like that the middle and working class have been left by upper class families. And once those upper class families left, the factories left, the restaurants left, the dry cleaning left, and so then you have concentration of poverty in those neighborhoods. We know that education in the U.S. is tied to your housing. So if you have lower income housing, then you have a lower tax base. If you have people leaving, you would have a lower tax base, those kind of things. So Wilson argues that the factors leading to the change is the exodus of two-parent families and exodus of employable folks. So basically, you end up with a neighborhood, a community that has intense concentrated poverty. And the consequences of this intense poverty is depletion of resources. You have lack of support for schools and churches. You have a breakdown in normative structure. You have a rise in crime rates, a rise in poverty, and lower sex ratio. And the sex ratio means that it accounts for the number of women compared to the number of men. So if you have a low sex ratio, that means that in these communities, there's a lot of women living in those communities and a lot less men living in those communities. So his structural approach of Wilson's solution was across the board economic plan, and he wanted to retain affirmative action and created jobs for folks on welfare. So in one of his earlier books, he talks about summer programs for teenagers who have been criminal justice involved, and it talks about park attendance, and some of the things that you would supposedly learn is showing up on time, how to clean up, and those kind of factors. Opportunity structures make for higher quality schools, college scholarships available to low-income folks, providing job training for low-income youth and unemployed, provide jobs in low-income areas such as and which would provide adequate pay or a living wage, and low-level skill required or on-job training for people. William Julius Wilson talked about relocating manufacturing industrial jobs and provide childcare for single parents or some kind of avenue for single parents so that they could go to work. The incentives would be to provide free birth control, sex education, implement programs in high schools which will attract low-income youth, like SAT programs or magnet schools. Those kinds of programs in low-income area tend to also segregate students. So like middle class or upper class students will go to the magnet program, but they're in separate classes in separate parts of the school. Increase welfare payments to those recipients who do go to school. So there's a Texas law which requires students who are on financial aid to attend for over half of the class. That's also true here in Illinois. I have gotten inquiries about whether students have attended throughout the semester or not. So these quotes are coming from a book talking about, the main question was, people think that, one of the arguments is that people think that people don't want to work. And so what the anthropologist did was she went to like a McDonald's job, and she interviewed people between the ages of like 16 and 25 and asked them about why were they working at like a McDonald's job. And so this is from Carmen. Carmen said, my dad works at night, well, night and day, because now he has 2 jobs. We're living in a studio. There's a room, a kitchen, and a bathroom, and there's 5 of us in it. It costs $700 and something for that studio. My dad starts working at 6 in the afternoon and works until about 3 a.m. He gets home at 5 and goes to sleep. When he gets up, does his other job. His wife works during the day and gets off at about 4. So again, the question that the author is asking is, why would low-income people work? So you can see that. Then there's the next woman is Keisha, living with mother and has a son. I just got Medicaid for my son. They said that I made too much at Burger Barn to get Medicaid. I said $150 a week. Shit, I guess I have to be completely broke to get medical assistance. This world is cheap, because if I wanted to build a missile, I'd get over 10 billion. So you can see in this quote that she's working at Burger Barn, and she's trying to get health insurance for her son, and the system is set up so that she makes too much money for health insurance for her son, even though it's not a living wage. So Herbert Gaines, who's an older guy, he's already passed. He wrote a book called The War Against the Poor, and in this book, Dr. Gaines argued that we racialize the undeserving, and basically we stigmatize them. And this has happened throughout history. So English poor laws of the mid-19th century, if you're into Charles Dickens and the poorhouse, right? If people had debts, then they could end up in the poorhouse. And there's a difference between shiftless and working poor. So people who are homeless or other factors, right, don't necessarily have the wherewithal to work, but the working poor are working all the time. So in Gaines' discussion in his book against the War Against the Poor, he talked about Irish and then all the other waves of immigrants, such as Italians and Eastern European Jews. So as we get immigrants coming in throughout the country, throughout to the United States, we increase the this whole trope of that people don't want to work, right? And we can see this with the former president talking about how Mexicans were coming into the United States and they were going to rape and or take your jobs or be criminal in some fashion. So who are the working poor? They tend to be young. Single parents, typically single mothers, is twice the single mothers. And we know from sociology of gender research that women make less than men. So that compounds the income, socioeconomic status of a household. They're poorly educated. So currently, if you have less than a high school diploma and you're white, you are making less than almost everyone else. So if we look at who are in the working poor, white folks is 5.4%, African Americans is 13.3%, and Hispanics is 14.6%. If we include Asian Americans, they're less than white folks in working poor. So this is coming back from the quote from the same book I discussed before with Carmen and Kaisha, that this was my first real job. I take it seriously, you know, it means a lot to me. I give you, what's the word I'm looking for? Security blanket, because a lot of married women, like when I was married to my husband, when he left, the burden was left on me. If Jason leave now, I can deal with the load because I work. Jason helps me. We split the bills half and half. But if he leaves, I'm not going to be well. Oh my God, I'm stranded. I have no money. No, I have a little blank bank account. I got my little nest egg, you know, so it does mean a lot to me. I wouldn't just leave my job. So if it's not what you know, it's who you know. We can see that Bourdieu's four capitals decrease people living in poverty. Also, education decreases people living in poverty. If you are a college-educated person, you may experience poverty at one point, but you're much more likely to cycle in and out of poverty. So people staying on welfare for a very long time is a very small minority. Bourdieu talked about 4 different kinds of capitals: economic, social, cultural, and human. So economic is what it just sounds like. It's how much wealth you have. So in the video People Like Us, right, you can see that people have assets and income and houses and cars and 401ks and all that kind of things. So think of Rockefellers who are birth to grave, um, are supported economically. They never really have to work. Social capital is what you're gaining right now. It's who you know. So all the NIU alumni in the Chicago area are potential social capital people because you could reach out to them and say, hey, I'm an NIU grad soon, and can you tell me about your position or your job or what helped you stay in this position? Cultural is what you know, so the difference between drinking American beer versus French wine, or being able to sit down at a table that has multiple courses and knowing which forks to use. And in human capital is the idea of the example I use is my dad could look at a piece of land and know exactly how many fence posts he needs and how much fencing he needs. So this is what the education you have, the skills that you bring. So if you're a welder, this would be human capital because you could weld things. And as you go along, right, as you build these four capitals, this typically increases your wealth. So we have the story of a rag to riches story, and this is the idea that individually you can just pull yourself up by the bootstraps, which means that there's no social structure to social class or social inequalities. It's just that you're not working hard enough. So this has been very popular in the 1800s all the way through until today. You can see that people who basically say, well, you're just not working hard enough, that's an individual argument that's related to this story. So if we go back to the book I just discussed earlier about the McJobs, and whether people were bootstrapping their way up in McDonald's, for example, in the Burger Barn that she did an ethnography in, it was all promoted internally. So if you're not getting along with the manager, then you're less likely to be promoted. And a lot of the people that she interviewed would leave too early for internal promotion to a higher paying management job. So this again, the idea that it's individually that you just need to work hard. It is true that if you leave too early, you can't get promoted, but you also are getting promoted because of social capital and economic capital. So there's a stigma related to working in a McJob or a McDonald's. So there's a whole discussion about managing the stigma. So Dr. Anderson wrote the book about Streetwise and trying to manage the stigma. Men would talk about independence, autonomy, and respect. And then breaking the stigma of being a welfare dependent person. One of the respondents said, not welfare dependent. I'm not ashamed because I have a job. I don't care what other people think. I just do not care. I have a job. It's my job. You ain't putting no food on my table. You ain't putting no clothes on my back. I will walk tall with my Burger Barn uniform on. Be proud of it. So in People Like Us, there's an episode at the beginning of the documentary which is talking about Tammy's story, and she works at a Burger King, I believe, and she walks miles back and forth to work. But her son is all upset about this because he says that she wears that uniform all the time. He doesn't like her walking back and forth in her uniform. And so they, in their own family, are trying to break the stigma and also manage the stigma of a mom working at a Burger Barn. So if you have a father-in-law like mine, you talk about family values, and he would make the argument that certain groups of people in the United States don't hold any family values. Carol Stack in 1970 wrote the book called All Our Kin, Strategies for Survival in a Black Community, found that fathers, uncles, men in general are much more present than folks think. They're not absent. This is also confirmed in Gang Leader for a Day. A rogue sociologist takes to the street. Black fathers, even if they don't live in the household, are more likely to be present for their children. They're more likely to economically support their children. They're more likely to read to their children than comparable white fathers who don't live in the same household and may make more money than the black fathers. So a lot of times in communities that Dr. Stack studied, they put the resources together. They'd have one working phone, another working car, and then they would do like carpooling to the grocery store on this day. And they looked out for children in the community to make sure they weren't getting in trouble. So some of the public policies to change poverty and decrease the social inequalities of social class is first wage subsidies and tax breaks. This is to hire certain group of people such as urban youth, welfare recipients. This was especially conducted in the 1990s where President Clinton decided to change the welfare system, and where you had to, if you were a welfare recipient, you had to demonstrate that you had applied for so many jobs or you were in school. Today we see that some states have drug testing, and another wage subsidy and tax break is the earned income tax credit. So if you have enough low paid workers with children, then they get a credit on their income taxes. Another way is to move people to where there are jobs. So in Chicago, for example, there is a spatial mismatch where there are lots of people who are unemployed, but the positions are, say, in the suburbs. So one of the ideas, or one of the things that has been done, is that a lot of times people were moved out of the Chicago low-income areas and moved to DeKalb or Rockford and other places. For the most part, the families that were moved from Chicago to Rockford are doing better educationally, have employment and stuff like that. At the beginning, there was a disconnect between communities who had watched their children, so they didn't have social capital, so they didn't have people watching their kids, so they would go back to Chicago because they had people who could watch their kids. William Julius Wilson talks about the Marshall Plan for Inner Cities, and this is coming out of World War II and the World Wars, and having empowerment zones, which give tax breaks to businesses that move into low-income areas. This has shown negative results. For example, in DeKalb, out by 3M and other places, they have been given tax breaks over and over again. They're told in the contract that they have to hire so many local people. They never hire that many local people, and then they typically get up and leave where they can move to lower income countries. Unions is another public policy that can work. So the union leadership has tended to be white and male, and the membership has tended to be non-white and women, so people of color. We can see this in the book Nickel and Dime about trying to unionize Walmart. If you have a union, people tend to make more in salary or income than non-union groups. Another public policy is child care and health care, so it reduces the prices of daycare. And this has worked for a lot of parents about being able to be safe and secure that their children are fine while they go off to work. So some new ideas is schooling, having an apprenticeship like they do in Germany, where schools and employers join together, paying partially for training. It keeps the kids in school for longer and up-to-date skills, provides opportunity for high-quality skills which will go directly to the workforce, relies upon standardized nationally representative skills by the schools and employees. An example is green jobs, teaching people how to put solar panels on is really high income earning kind of thing. In DeKalb School District and Sycamore, they partner with Kishwaukee Community College, and they have programs about welding and aircraft and stuff like that. Another new idea is social capital via summer programs. And that idea is Texas A&M, for example, between your bachelor's and grad school career, you can do a summer program where you are mentored by 1 or 2 faculty members. you work on a research project, you take the research project to a conference, you meet more and more people. And then promoting internal mobility. Another new idea is living wage, so having wages that are 125% above the poverty level, and the wage should be calculated based on food, housing, childcare, and transportation. And usually, if you have a living wage, it has to be more than 125% above the poverty level. So here are some clips about a living wage. Here are some questions to think about poverty. So who are the invisible people at NIU? And is part of the responsibility of an educational institution to raise the floor for all? Why or why not? So education, for example, in the documentary about living wage, higher education is considered a democratic institution. What do you think about this? And Anna Cooper discussed the amount of resources invested in a person should be given back to the community many folds. What do you think about this summation idea? So the other aspects of poverty is feminization of poverty, which means that there tends to be more single mothers and women who are living in poverty. The elderly are living in poverty. And there are two explanations for this. The one is structural, so lack of economic resources, low gender ratio, lack of job training and education, and less pay for women overall. And in cultural, so attitudes about premarital sex, increase in single parent families, and socialization into welfare. Solutions to poverty is cultural. Change values and beliefs of poor. One can do this by teaching values and beliefs in schools. So instead of having a self-fulfilling prophecy where you motivate students to achieve, increase self-confidence and esteem, and increase value of education in minds of students and parents. And socialization of young, offering parental classes which focus on such things as differential socialization, provide role models for young to emulate. The limitations to these suggestions: difficult to change values and beliefs if you're not a member of the group. If values and beliefs result from adaptation to social environment, that you need to change the environment also. So then we have move on to gender inequality, economic inequality, explaining economic inequality, individual characteristics about age, education, work, structural characteristics about dual economy, family structure, consequences of divorce, and there's unexplained unexplained economic inequality like gender segregation and discrimination. There's inequality in education, so tracking and labeling people so they don't take the AP course or take other aspects. Lower courses, remedial courses, barriers for women is glass ceiling, glass escalators, sticky floors, and levels of education. So currently women outperform men in almost every aspect except in the workforce. They still earn less than men. There's also inequality in the family, so working women's double burden of the second shift and third shift. These are ideas about where women have paid work, then they go home and they take care of their kids, and that's the second shift, and the third shift is volunteering for their kids' organization. Leisure and pleasure in the home, so men in a heterosexual relationship are doing more than their fathers. However, it's still lopsided where women are doing all of the cooking and cleaning and stuff like that, and men have lots of leisure time. And we still devalue homemakers or mothers or service child care people, right? We don't tend to pay them as much as we say pay a CEO or something like that. Political inequality. So historically, participation in political system, the voters, candidates, and elected officials. We still see at the federal level that the majority of people at the top tend to be white men. If you have a record, then you cannot participate in voting or the political rights. Later in the semester, You're going to see a video talking about this, related to the politics and not being able to vote, historically participation in the military, and then inequality by men's group, the price of privilege, where they say basically things like, there's some way for that men should be making more than women, and it's also racialized.